Hey, this is four-time Black Belt World Champion Dominica Obelenite. If you guys are looking to level up your jiu-jitsu game with awesome jiu-jitsu courses on mindset, strategy, and beyond, make sure that you guys check out BJJ Mental Models Premium. I myself have a course up there, so make sure you guys check it out. Let's get you guys on that next step in your jiu-jitsu journey.
Hey, welcome to BJJ Mental Models, episode 213. I'm Steve Kwan. BJJ Mental Models is your guide to a conceptual and intelligent jiu-jitsu approach. Today, I'm pleased to be joined by a longtime supporter of our show, Lyzz Daemonette Mitrovic. Lyzz, how are you doing?
I'm doing excellent. I'm really excited to be a guest onto the podcast. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Most welcome. I'm glad to have you. Now, Lyzz has been a supporter of BJJ Mental Models for a very long time, but you may know Lyzz as the listener from her recent accomplishments this year. She won gold at Worlds Black Belt Masters. So newly minted Black Belt Masters World Champ. Congrats, Lyzz, and thanks so much for dropping by.
Yes, thank you. As you mentioned, I've been a listener of the podcast for such a long time, and it's so strange being on this side of the seat and hearing your voice in the conversations versus not just listening to you serenade me.
Well, hey, today everyone gets to listen to you, and that's exciting because I actually really like the topic that you selected. You wanted to talk about two things that come up very often. People bring this up all the time in our community, and I think that it's something that everyone can relate to: perfectionism and imposter syndrome. Two things that are quite closely related. But maybe instead of me digging into that first, Lyzz, why don't you talk a little bit about these topics and what they mean to you?
I recognize I am a perfectionist, and it's basically trying to put standards on yourself to make everything perfect. You are trying to meet every goal as perfectly as possible. And that kind of wraps into the imposter syndrome, because when you don't meet your goals, sometimes you feel like you are an imposter in whatever field you might be feeling an imposter about. For today's topic, and for me, I felt the most like identifying with jiu-jitsu for feeling an imposter.
Well, let me ask then, because this is a term that I am quite familiar with, but every once in a while people message me and they hear this term come up in our conversations and they ask about it. What is imposter syndrome? How would you define something like that?
It's either you have the educational background, the experience, or everything that you have the accolades and the experience to talk about what you're discussing or representing or being a speaker of. But when you are the person presenting, you don't feel like you are aligning or belonging there because you don't feel like you have what the accolades, the experience, or the training to provide whatever you're working on. So for jiu-jitsu, for me, it's like I received my black belt in 5 years, and within those 5 years, I had about 10 months off. So when I received my black belt, I didn't feel like I was a black belt because I was so fast onto the track. I did not feel like I was a black belt, and it took me at least 2 years of being a black belt and into this last year to feel like I actually belong where I should have recognized I was supposed to be the whole time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And I mean, I think that for new people in jiu-jitsu, they often have a degree of confidence issues because they're new, right? And I mean, it's one thing if you're a 3-month white belt, of course, you're going to have doubts about your ability because admittedly you are new at this. But imposter syndrome is when that self-doubt kind of carries on even well past the point where it makes any sense. And it is very common, especially for high performers, to doubt themselves a lot. You know, we talk about this quite a bit on the show with people who are very elite level athletes, and even they doubt themselves. And I always find that heartening personally because, you know, most people will never compete at the highest levels and they often doubt themselves. And so it's interesting to know that even the highest level performers do also experience those doubts sometimes. I would ask for you, what was the thing that changed it for you? Like, it sounds like you're saying that you've developed a lot more confidence recently, but what was the point that kind of flipped the switch for you?
For me, when the pandemic happened, there were some situations that I ended up having to shift into a new gym. And that shift into the new gym allowed me to kind of, it's funny when you shift your gyms, you're going to find there's different leadership, different parts of your journey that change. And for me, part of that journey was the mentality I had in my previous gym. I didn't have the same pressures on when I switched to this new place. And another part of that is the people I'm around help guide me. So one of the people that really helped me kind of just accept it's okay if you aren't perfect. It's okay because every time you're not perfect, you are making progress. Like no matter what you do, you're making progress forward. It doesn't need to be perfect. But as long as you're taking that step forward, you're making that step go. And that one of that person is Sarah McMahon. Like she really helped me accept and work on just guiding me into the performances that I've able to do. And also being the team that I have right now, they don't put the same amount of pressure that I felt on myself. It doesn't matter if I win or lose, they're always going to have my back. And having that acceptance allowed a lot of those pressures to diminish and just go down a couple steps.
And that's fascinating because you might intuitively think that, hey, a coach is supposed to put pressure on their athletes, but that can be a very bad idea. It can cause a lot of blowback and it can have a lot of side effects. We've talked to a lot of coaches who have talked about how particularly, when you're coaching children, you've got to be very mindful of the parents getting too involved in the coaching because they can just put so much pressure on their kids that the kids just can't perform anymore and it distracts from their ability to perform. So it's kind of this weird thing where actually creating a more relaxed environment can bring out better performance.
Absolutely. Like I know I have some of my friends that train jiu-jitsu that they do incredibly well with that pressure. Like they need that pressure. What I found is when I had that extra pressure, because I'm already putting the pressure of perfectionism on myself naturally, it was just a lot of extra pressure to try to perform perfectly. And kind of just made an implosion where if I didn't meet those goals, I was devastated and had to find a way to pick myself up and decide to compete again.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that's the thing, right? If to you winning is the only thing that matters and doing it perfect is the only thing that matters, then if you ever fail to win or fail to achieve your goals, it can break your ego completely. It can break your sense of self. You see this a lot with athletes at very high levels who, when they're winning, they seem confident and unbeatable. But as soon as they lose, they just completely fall apart and they're never the same again.
Exactly. And for me, since my journey was so fast, I had pretty good successes in my lower belts. That was the other problem is I did well. Like I won a couple world titles, like no gi and gi for my purple and brown belt. And not at the same time, like I won no gi purple belt and one gi for brown belt. But I had those pressure. People are like, oh, you're going to do amazing at black belt. And then I didn't have enough time. Wouldn't you know? I didn't have that. And so that pressure.
Yeah, that is the thing that I think people, especially in the junior belts, don't always have a perspective of, which is when you are competing at, say, purple belt, right? You're competing in a range with people who have plus or minus a year or two of experience in line with you. But when you're competing at black belt, it's just a wide open ocean. You're competing with basically everyone at that level. And you could be in there with people who have 5, 10, 15 years more experience than you. Or on the flip side, you could be competing with athletes who are much, much younger than you and in their athletic prime. And so kind of in both directions, there's so much more variability. I totally get where you're coming from here.
It's very common. One of the hard things is because I got my black belt in 2019 and I was at that other gym, I didn't have, and a lot of the people at the other gym didn't compete IBJJF. So I didn't have the understanding that it's really common. It's okay when you just get your black belt, that experience level, you'll eventually be that big shark in facing brand new baby black belts. But give yourself grace as you transition into just stepping into that black belt, because that range is huge, and it's okay to fail. You're going to compete a lot and fail a lot, but it's not a failure. The only failure is stopping. And there are so many times I wanted to stop. And because I didn't stop, I am where I am, and I'm going to continue going forward.
Now, I remember very distinctly having a similar experience to what you're describing many years ago when I got my blue belt. And I think kind of at blue belt, there's a similar crisis of confidence that grapplers get. And I don't know this for sure, but I would guess that's probably why blue belts get this reputation for quitting. You know, when you're a white belt, you go in there and everything is new and exciting and there's no expectations. And most of the time you're in there just training with other white belts. And so, you know, it's kind of like wide open and it's just fun. It's just play. But then when you get the blue belt, all of a sudden now there's expectations that you've put on yourself about how good you should be. And you look ahead at these other belts like purple, brown, black, and you realize, man, it's going to take me a decade to climb the rest of this mountain to black belt. And it just feels so insurmountable and so far away. And I kind of think that maybe the reason why so many blue belts bail is just because they're really hard on themselves, harder than they should be, and they expect more out of themselves than is reasonable for that level.
Gosh, yes. Oh my goodness. It's sometimes hard or difficult to just know. Something that broke through for me this past year is like I was devastated after losing in pants. I got third and it was an auto medal. So like that's why I was devastated as I worked so hard, changed things. And then fast forward to later this year, one of those big things is I forget how helped me have this revelation, but I realized that as long as I keep going forward, I will be a world champion one day. If I'm going to be 70, I'm going to be a world champion when I'm 70. But if I stop, I'll never be a world champion. So it's like, as long as I keep going forward, that is the big thing that I picked up onto is, and that same thing with your belts will come. You just have to know that it's going to be there. You just need to put the work and the time in, and your journey, you will eventually get to black belt as long as you don't stop.
Yeah. I mean, people have different understandings of what the belt should mean, and there is no official formal standard, right? But I've always thought of the belt system as being a marker of personal progress more than anything, right? As long as you're constantly getting better, you should at one day be able to get to the point where you deserve that black belt. I mean, not all black belts have to be world champions. There's a lot of different ways that you can earn that distinction. And so I think that sometimes people do get really, really hard on themselves. And again, that comes back to perfectionism. I have a question for you. I wonder, do you think there's something about the way that we train this art that encourages perfectionism? Because I see this all the time where students at all levels are beating themselves up because they can't do the technique perfectly, or they can't pull it off easily in sparring, or they're not winning tournaments. And it just seems like people expect for everything to go perfect 100% of the time, and then they really take it personally when they struggle there.
That is an amazing point, because I do agree. And there's so many parts of our sport that encourage it. You know, when you are working on a drill or something, you're working repetitions in, you have to make, what is it they say? Like perfect technique makes perfect practice.
The old saying was practice makes perfect, but the kind of new revised thinking is perfect practice makes perfect.
Yes. That saying is drilled into us though when we're working our technique, when we're working our drills. And if you're going to compete, I feel like part of that pressure of making things perfect comes out into when you try to compete, especially when you first have your first tournament, you have those expectations of trying to compete perfect. And because you've also had the trickle down of expectations of having perfect drilling, perfect practice, and perfect execution of your techniques, all of that wraps up into you might not hit things perfectly, and the fear of failure hits you, and now you're really bummed out.
Yeah, you know, when I see these instructionals and I see these highlight clips on YouTube, you know, where people shoot some incredible technique sequence that they've drilled, I always feel bad because I look at it and I think, man, when I roll, it doesn't look that pretty. But I think that's part of the problem is people look at these highly curated demo reels and they're always done exactly perfectly. And people then think, well, that's what it should look like. And that's how it's always going to look like. And if I can't do it like that, then there's something wrong with me.
Yes.
But what no one ever told me was like, it never looks perfect in the real world because you got some person who's trying to fight you, right? They're trying to actively stop you. So it's going to be ugly. It's going to look imperfect, but as long as it works, that's all that really matters.
Yes. And what they don't talk about is the body types. Some techniques will work so good for some body types, but it won't work perfectly for maybe other body types. And that also matters. And people need to take that into account. Like they see this fancy spider guard technique, but then they might have maybe they have shorter legs and they can't execute that spider guard as beautifully as the other person. I completely agree. That definitely adds to the problem.
Yeah, I think that sometimes we fail to teach people this. We kind of tell them, okay, here's the technique and everyone should be able to do it. And we sort of set the expectation that if we can't, there's something wrong with you. But yeah, I mean, body type differences are a real thing. I mean, my legs are pretty short and pretty thick. Against most normal sized people, I can't even lock on a triangle. Like it doesn't matter if I know how to do it properly or not. Like if my legs just physically can't do it due to body dimensions, that's just the way that it is. That's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Our uniqueness is what lets us carve out different game plans and different things that work for us and for people like us. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I think sometimes people do expect that, well, man, if I can't do this exactly like Marcelo Garcia did, then there must be something wrong with me.
And I feel like going alongside with that is that's part of the art part. It's going to be your own, it's your own journey and it's going to be your own style. And that's also where we get new moves from. Like if one thing is shown one way and you've learned how to adapt it for your own self, that's how new stuff comes along. And I feel like we forget about adding that in when we're so focused into making things perfect and exactly how we see them.
So I've got a question here for you because you talked about how at the gym that you train out of now with Sarah McMahon and the team there, or the affiliation that you're under, that they have an attitude where they embrace differences and they discourage perfectionism. And I'd love to know how that manifests in practice. Like when you come in there, what is the coaching environment like and how is it conducive to getting past things like perfectionism and imposter syndrome?
We have a lot of fun. I know it's important. Like you think we have so much fun in jiu-jitsu, but sometimes when you're so focused on making things perfect or you're trying to reach those goals, you forget about living in that moment. And in our gym, we have a lot of fun. Like we definitely harass each other in the fun way, like we poke fun, and there's a lot of camaraderie. One of the things I'll tell beginners at our gym that are walking in from day one is we are known to be a competitive school, but we're not going to tear you down to get you there. We're going to lift you up along the way. And I feel like the philosophy at the gym is mostly we're going to lift you up. We're not going to tear you down and we're not going to leave you behind. We'll always support you regardless of your results. Or if you're a hobbyist, we're going to support you on your goals and just be there for each other.
I recall one time having a really negative training experience at a different gym where clearly they were a hyper-competitive gym and clearly winning was the biggest priority. And as a result, they put a ton of pressure on the students. And something that I noticed as possibly a side effect of that is the instructor clearly only really cared about people that he thought he could make a champion out of, which creates a very frustrating training environment because you'll have a room of like 30, 40 people, but there's one chosen one that the instructor clearly wants to focus their attention on, and the rest of the students are just basically left to fend for themselves, right? It's a very, very transparently toxic training environment, and I think that's an example of, again, where perfectionism can be a bad thing.
Completely agree. And to add to this, one of the things we do at our school is if we're doing situationals or we're rolling, we have a medal. It's like an IBJJF medal. We've labeled over it and it's called the asshole medal. So if you're rolling like an asshole, let's say you are a 200-pound man and you are going with somebody much smaller that like 100 pounds, some like female or just another partner, and you decide to throw them with all of your strength and you land on top of them, you might be awarded the asshole medal, which is not something to be happy about. Although
that's great. It's like a reverse incentive.
Yes. You'll be awarded it at the end of class. And surprisingly, because we have that, and I don't know if it's because of that or just the environment we have, it's not awarded very often. I think it's because when we try to encourage and we guide our students quite a bit to, if you are a larger person, to roll with the smaller people and to, go technique for technique. Don't just use your strength attribute to knock people down.
Yeah. And now this is an area where perfectionists often beat themselves up way too much, which is they expect that they should be able to play a perfect game against someone who is either equivalently experienced to them, but a lot bigger, or maybe someone who is just way more experienced than them. You'll see this a lot where like a blue belt will go in there and get smoked by a brown belt, and then that blue belt will just beat themselves up over it for weeks. Or maybe, a blue belt will go in there and try to fight another blue belt who weighs 100 pounds more. And when they struggle, they beat themselves up over it, which is, I used to be that guy, so I can relate. It's not an effective way to think about how to train jujitsu. But I'm sure that you've had that experience too. And I'd love to hear your stories on this as to, if there's ever situations where you felt that you've unfairly beat yourself up.
Oh my gosh. Hey, Steve, it's me. Hello. I'm that person. Yes. So when I started I'll use my blue belt days, I guess, I got down to like 150 pounds, and I would always challenge the biggest person in the room because I'm like, I'm going to be able to do this. Jiu-jitsu is for the smaller person. I could take them out. And I would try to take out the 200-pound MMA guys who cut down to like 160, 170. And of course, like their size would beat me down. I'm like, but we're both blue belts. Why am I not taking them out? And they've also have so much more experience than I did because I progressed pretty quickly. I got my blue belt in 6 months. So I didn't really have that foundation that a white belt would have. So I tried to do some moves, and after class, I'm sure we all can really relate with this. It's the go to your car, you roll up the windows, we either turn on music to drown out your uncontrollable sobs of like, what the hell happened? Why am I not reaching where I should? And not accepting also that when you're doing your moves, you have to take into other accounts or ask questions. So like if what you're doing isn't working, you don't have to have the answers. You can actually go ask other people, like, I'm doing this. How can I work to get past this? And when I was a blue belt, I didn't ask those questions. I didn't feel very comfortable because I thought that I needed to know the answers. But the reality is you don't need to know the answers. You're still learning, and that's okay. It's okay to ask questions. You should be asking questions. If you're not asking questions, maybe you should.
Yeah, I think sometimes we get it in our heads. We just expect that we should be able to always win. And when things don't go according to plan or according to the way that we envision them, we beat ourselves up over it. But you got to remember, this is like a 2-person dance, right? You're in there training with someone else who's also doing their best to win. And look, sometimes they're going to win. Sometimes you're going to win. Sometimes you're going to be in there with someone who is just more experienced or more athletic than you. And if you beat yourself up over it, it just discourages you from getting back on the horse, unfortunately. Whereas I love that approach that you're talking about, which is you're kind of more introspective and you use that as an opportunity to learn. But it's hard to do, right? It's hard to do in there when you roll into class and you came in a good mood, but then you feel deflated after you go. It's hard to flip that mindset around. I would be very curious to know if you've got any pointers for doing that you've encountered in your training.
So one of the things I did when I started, and it was up until I became a brown belt that I shifted into a different way to kind of navigate this. When I first started jiu-jitsu, I came from another martial art, and what was required from us in that other martial art was to have a training journal. And inside that training journal, you were supposed to write down your techniques. And in jiu-jitsu, how I changed it is I didn't just write down what we learned that day, is I also wrote down who my training partners were, because I'm terrible with names, what happened during those rolls with those people, and if there was submissions, if I could remember how the submissions were set up, or if I submitted somebody, how I got to those positions, so that I can start to refine my training into a constructive way. 1, I can see the things I'm good at, or 2, see the things that didn't work out, and then ask those questions directly about how to resolve those issues.
Yeah. I think that's a great approach, right? Because you're almost making it almost scientific in a way where rather than just going in there and looking at it as a series of W's and L's. You're going in there and you're looking at each session almost like an experiment, and you're trying to sort out what worked, what didn't, and how you can address that problem and gain more knowledge for the next time.
Exactly. Yes. And it's truly a lab. That's how I approached jiu-jitsu at that time. And I still approach it that way. But yes, that's exactly how I did it. I would approach it like as an experiment. And the other reason why I really enjoyed setting it up as an experiment is because beyond just the figuring out what you needed to work and improve upon, it also gave you mini games or goals to try to achieve. So like if you identify that this part in your game needs improvement, now you can start working to learn different escapes to practice if you get there again. Or maybe you need to work on drilling those so that you get faster at reacting. So it allowed to focus and play, keep it interesting and engaging, which also can help with if you have something interesting and engaging to attempt into class, that can also help with your motivation to keep training and surpassing the pressure you might feel if you've experienced failure or if you're really uncomfortable in a position. It just gives you the confidence to try to get over that little hurdle.
Now, there's something you've mentioned a few times here. You've talked about the importance of keeping it playful and of making a game out of it. And these are things that I've heard repeatedly, actually, from other people recently in terms of good practices for the gym. I think these are powerful techniques to combat our tendency to be perfectionists and our tendencies to have imposter syndrome. If you can think of it less as a competition where there's a winner or a loser, and more as a game that we all play together to get better at, I think that helps a lot. And I'm a gamer, you're a gamer, so we can probably relate. You know, I work in tech, and people, when they're building tech products, they're always talking about gamification, right? The process of trying to make things more fun and more playful and to give people fun goals they can work towards. And I think, to me, that's a big part of creating a good gym culture, is making it feel like when your students are in there, they're playing a game and they're having fun. You know, it's different when you're out there competing, I suppose, but when you're in the room, it should be a fun experience for everyone, I think. And to me, if it's not, that's where I'm going to guess you're going to see a lot of perfectionists and a lot of unhappy people.
Absolutely. And so you're going to train hard and you're going to put in as much effort as you can put into something, jiu-jitsu. And every person wants to try to achieve their goals. Like when they're playing jiu-jitsu, you want to work to submit or work maybe your escapes, etc. And keeping it fun allows you the freedom to get to those without having that pressure. And even in tournaments, like you want to try to keep it fun. Of course, we all want to win and do what you need to do to get to that end goal. However, if you get to the top, if you win first, you want to feel like it's that celebration of all of your hard work and accumulation. You don't want to go there feeling like, okay, I achieved my goal. That's it. I did it. If you don't have fun getting to there and you push yourself into the ground trying to get to that goal and you feel that burnout, it's not going to feel as satisfying. So like for me, that's another big training with this new gym, that we keep it a lot of fun and it alleviates all that pressure. And it feels great to go to the gym. It's the best part of the day.
Yeah, I can relate. I mean, I think that maintaining a positive and fun mindset is such a key part to building a good gym. And, you know, I get the chance to talk to a lot of people who compete professionally, and some of them, you know, they really struggle emotionally with the pressure of competing, and it stops being fun. And regardless of how dedicated you are to winning, it's hard to maintain your enthusiasm over the long term if the sport stops being fun to you. That's one of the things I love about jiu-jitsu, is that it's fun, right? I wouldn't have stuck with it for so long if I weren't having fun, especially in the early days. And so I think that it behooves all coaches to make things fun. You know, on that note of gamifying and making the class more fun, like, what do you guys do? I would definitely love to hear if you've got any practices that you've adopted for how to make things fun, both for yourself and also for your training partners.
Before I answer this question, I want to take note that, relate back to what you just said, one of the philosophies that this new gym, the head professor, mentioned was competing in a tournament it's the biggest party. You've worked so hard to get there. Like, that's not the pressure that you should feel. It's like the celebration of all your hard work, regardless of the results, because you've prepared. All that preparation and hard work, regardless of the result, is going to still be there. And so when you go out and compete, it's a celebration of all of your hard work to get to that competition. So I just want to make mention of that. And relating back to the question that you just asked, some of the ways that we like to keep it fun, our school is big into doing situationals. So we do, and again, like that's almost a little mini game of working the techniques. So our school structure is we'll do a monthly topic, and that monthly topic will have, a few techniques that we work the same technique throughout the week. And when we work that same technique every day of that week, we'll have those situationals. So it really gets you to understand the position. And for lower belts, it helps you work what you just learned. And for them, keeping it fun is working with them. So in those situationals, if I'm working with somebody that's equal level to me, or let's say they're a larger opponent, I'll work my dominant side or my other favorite side. I always call it my other favorite side because I'm trying to keep it positive, I don't have a bad side. So I try to work my other favorite side, and we just go back and forth with it. For people that aren't skilled at the same skill level, or they're smaller people, I work that other favorite side, and I don't use all of my strength. I use more of that technique on them so that it's technique for technique. And sometimes I don't win, and that's intentional because it's important to have their growth too inside that. So it's finding that balance of trying to make sure you're maintaining your wins for yourself, but also finding that balance of allowing your partners to also get their wins, because it's important for them to grow as well.
Yeah. And that, flies, I think, contrary to the mindset that a lot of hyper-competitive gyms would have, where, the experienced people would go in there and just mop the floor with all of the white belts. But this is something that I hear a lot, where in gyms where they've got elite high-level athletes, those people will often talk about how, look, they don't just go in there and just beat up all of the white belts mercilessly. They find ways to elevate the white belts so that they're getting something out of it too. And, there's a lot of different ways you can go about that. But give me an example here. If you're in there with someone who maybe they're a relatively new white or blue belt, and okay, this person's got no chance against me, right? Just based on experience and skill level alone. How do you make the role fun as the black belt there so that both of you have fun and get something out of the experience?
So part of it for me is if we're doing situationals, I already have that position. But let's say we're in a regular role. I'll ask them what position either that they're working on or their favorite positions. If it's a white belt, they don't have too much that they know about, I'll ask them that. And from there, what we'll do is I'll either give them that position or make them work to that position. So if they are working good technique, I'll sweep them. Or if they're trying to advance their position and they do a grip that is not advantageous, I don't take advantage of it, but I let them know that is happening. And I do that by action. However, I make note of it so that after our roll, I'll let them know, I have a mini conversation if it's a less experienced lower belt. I think it's really important to have that discussions. It's not always you have to gauge it. I'm not always coaching the students. Sometimes students just want to go immediately back into the next role. And I get that because sometimes I do too. But I'll help them if I can identify something, I'll do it. But I also allow them to work towards getting to that position. So if they do a great job, I'll allow them to get there. And from there, then I work my escapes. So they don't feel that pressure that they're not providing something to that role, because every time you roll with somebody, there is always something to gain in a role. If they have less experience or equally experienced or more experience than you, there's opportunities to grow from every role you have, with exceptions of if your partners you don't feel safe in your roles. I do have to put that caveat in there.
Yeah, that's something that I think not enough of us coach students about, right? Like, look, in an ideal world, every role is fun and productive, and your expectations are aligned with the other person's. So if you're just in there to kind of casually work technique, hopefully the other person is too. If you're in there to do a hard spar and you want to, you want to do something competitive, hopefully the other person's on the same page. But sometimes those expectations get mismatched, right? And this can often happen in a gym that is very perfectionist, where maybe one partner is just absolutely hell-bent on winning the role, and that's not aligned with the other person's expectations. And that can be a little bit tricky if there's a massive skill discrepancy, right? I mean, if you're a white belt and you're in there with a black belt who's totally determined on just smashing and destroying you, I don't think that's a great experience for either person.
No.
What do you do in a situation like that where the expectations are mismatched? I mean, we've always told people, hey, look, you don't have to roll with someone if you don't feel comfortable. But in practice, I know that can often be harder. That's easier said than done. So I would definitely be curious to know if you've got any thoughts on how to, make sure that your expectations are aligned with your training partners.
So there's a few ways. At my previous gym, one of the hard things that I struggled a lot with and that kind of elevated my perfectionism is in the imposter syndrome for me is I was one of the only females that consistently trained, and eventually we got more to join. However, we didn't have a lot of women at the gym, and at that gym I was at, it was incredibly competitive, and it was a big MMA school. And why I say those is because they're professional, and it's not just big MMA, they are professional MMA players. It's a big team. And why I mention that is because it was a big MMA team, they had a lot of people that would come in for no-gi, and they would just be like, okay, we'll just roll with you or whatever. Or they wouldn't roll with me at all. And that was because I would start to roll with them and our experience levels would come through. Or I'm a little ashamed of this, but the thing is I've grown from this. So I'm just going to lay this out, is I used to be very much, and this is where that perfectionism and competitiveness would come in, and I feel like that spoke from the gym culture, is I would, if dealing with somebody who would start using all of their strength, even though they're larger than me, I would try to tap them as fast as I could and as much as I could. And that was because I wanted to prove myself. I felt I had to do that in that gym. Oh goodness, my cat is meowing.
It's been a long time since we've had a cat interrupt the podcast. That used to happen all the time. Then I figured out how to barricade them out of my room.
I thought I did. Crafty lady. One moment, I'm sorry.
Oh, no worries.
Okay, sorry about that. I just said, why I'm ashamed of that now is because I can see that there's a disconnect in the conversation and the lack of communication of trying to ask what they're trying to get from the role, or just seeing there is a disconnection there. One of my biggest experiences, I'm going to go off on another tangent here, is I was rolling with somebody who was from, I think he was from Tennessee, but he was a new MMA person visiting the gym to see if that was going to be their home gym and new team. And we were rolling no-gi. And the first instance I got with him is I swept him a couple times. I could feel his energy was really aggressive. And so I started to lay on the technique and decide to try to tap him as much as I could, which led him getting to throwing elbows.
Oh boy.
The first elbow he threw, I thought was an accident. And then the second elbow he threw, I realized it wasn't an accident. And that is when I refused to roll with him. After that, I ended the roll right there and then. Why I mention this is because many years has passed and I've held on to that experience and use it to warn others to talk about. I talk with your partners and ask them, what is their experience level? First question, if you're rolling no-gi and they don't have belts, is what's your experience level? And do you leg locks, yes or no? And then from there, I found out many years later that he'd never rolled with a female before that ever gave him any trouble. The females he had rolled before with, he was able to, it was more of a playful game with him. And so he felt like the need to get out of that situation, and he just decided to use his MMA into it. He just kind of like blanked is what he told me. And he's really ashamed of that. So I appreciate him apologizing and recognizing it within himself that was something that was wrong and incorrect at the time. But in my opinion, that still doesn't excuse the actions that came out of it.
Yeah, that kind of experience is all too common, unfortunately. I mean, I've always figured it's got to be pretty challenging being a woman in this martial art that is so male dominated. It is getting better for sure. I mean, the progress in terms of women's grappling is tremendous to watch, but it is still at this point in time very much male dominated. And it's got to be hard for a woman to get a good roll out of guys, because I find that very rarely are they completely level about things, right? Normally either it's playful and they're not doing much, but then as soon as they start getting threatened, their ego kicks in and they just try to absolutely kill their training partner. You know, you see this a lot, unfortunately, where, you know, a woman is sparring with a man and at first the guy is just barely doing anything because he's kind of afraid to engage. But then when he realizes that, oh shit, this girl's actually good at this, the fragile male ego kicks in and they try to kill her, right? I mean, I've seen this very, very frequently. And it's got to be a challenge. I mean, I can't put myself in your shoes, but I've always figured it's got to be a challenge when you have partners who never give you a good, fair roll. They're either going 0% or they're going 110%. And they switch back and forth from one to the other based on kind of what the ego is doing at the moment. That is a challenge. Even as a guy, I have had that before, you know, where you're rolling with someone and you can tell that their goal is to win at all costs. And I am never comfortable rolling in that environment. I mean, I know that some people, especially black belts, will try to tough it out, but honestly, I just don't see the benefit. If I'm in there with a white belt and I think they're going to lose their mind and legitimately do anything they can to try to win a gym roll, there's a good chance I'm going to try to stop the roll and get out of there, because there's nothing to win, right? There's no benefit to engaging in a situation like that. Like you said, it can sometimes get violent. I mean, you know, most people who stick around jiu-jitsu for a long time should theoretically know the etiquette, but there's a lot of crazy people who come in for a trial class and totally screw things up and never come back again. So you do have to be careful. And that bit about being vocal about your expectations and your goals for the role and what you agree upon, it's important, because there's a ton of variability in the different gyms, in different rule sets. And it's very important to always be clear that you and your partner are on the same page before you start a role.
Yeah, jiu-jitsu is a conversation, but rather than using your words, you're using your bodies. And without communicating, that might lead to miscommunication and your intentions behind that. So
it reminds me of something that, you know, bad advice that I've heard from coaches is talking about how, you know, if you're a purple belt, that means you should never, ever be able to lose to a blue belt or a white belt, right? People kind of set this expectation that the belt has some sort of magical property. And I think what happens then is people's perfectionism instincts kick in. And if they feel threatened by a lower belt, they will go all out to try to defend themselves because they don't want to be seen as losing to someone beneath them. And I think that kind of perfectionism can lead to pretty toxic and even dangerous gym environments sometimes, right? Because if you are in a place where a senior belt would rather hurt their training partner than lose to them, that's not a good thing at all.
No. In my previous gym, like that was definitely, they didn't preach it in that way, but you can tell in the expectation and the way that people would react if a lower belt was to start getting an advantageous position. You can see like the desperation in their movements. Because the gym, it was so male dominated, it definitely also assisted with the imposter syndrome. So like I'm going to wrap this back into when you were talking about the zero, it's either 0% or 100%. You never really know where you stood unless like you won that round in your technique and feeling like you had that placement within the gym of understanding I am this rank or I am this.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is a challenge that all grapplers do deal with at some point, is especially as you get up the ranks. You know, I remember, especially when I was a brown belt, being really hard on myself. And if I ever got tapped by a purple or a blue belt, I would feel terrible for the rest of the day, right? But one of the main mindset changes I had when I got to black belt was I learned to kind of stop caring about that and to embrace that, right? The belt honestly doesn't mean anything. I mean, jiu-jitsu is a game of probabilities. You know, you go in there and you roll with 1,000 blue belts, which you will. And every once in a while, one of them is going to bust out something crazy or they're going to catch you off guard. I mean, that's part of the learning process and nobody is immune to it. I've seen very, very good high level athletes make a mistake and get tapped by a hobbyist in the gym, right? These things happen to everyone. And the question is your mindset accepting of that before it happens? And I think that's a challenge a lot of people struggle with.
Absolutely. And if you can accept that, asking the question to that person, if they tapped you with something, asking them what they did to set it up. You can learn stuff from lower belts. You can, each person, again, especially if you're visiting a new gym and that happens, it should excite you in some degree because it means that you're about to learn something that you didn't know before or that you left an opening that now you can work to fill.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, from my perspective, basically, a lot of my big learning breakthroughs happened when I trained with someone who was able to expose me. You know, when you train with the same people over and over again, and for most people, they're going to train with the same people most of the time, just due to the fact that most people kind of have a home gym, you kind of become inoculated against each other's games and you know what other people are going to do, so you can defend really well. But sometimes you roll in and you train with strangers and they're going to do stuff that you have no idea what to expect. And yeah, they can expose you. You know, if they are really good at something that you simply aren't good at, they might be able to punch holes in your game. And like you said, you should be grateful for that. You should be excited about that because that means you found an area to improve on. And usually those kinds of exposures where you discover a big weakness in your game, that normally is led by a period of growth. So it should be an exciting thing. It shouldn't be something that you beat yourself up over and get depressed over.
The ego will be sad in the moment, but if you can embrace learning from that mistake in the long term, your growth will be so much more exponential.
So do you have a switch that you flip when you go into competition? Like, I'd just be curious to know how you juggle kind of the dual mindsets of how you train in the gym in a supportive and friendly environment versus, okay, I'm in the, I'm in the finals of a world championship match. I mean, very different situations. So I'd love to know, how do you balance that? Or do you have the ability to turn it on or off, or what is it?
I flip the switch because in the gym, there are certain moves that I know I'm capable of and I can do them, but I won't do them with the intensity that I would do in a competition match. I know that this is due to like me practicing. So when I first started out, I was that white belt and that blue belt. I'm going to be real honest. I was. And I mean to say that, like, I thought that trying to win and beat, I was trying to beat the person in the gym was what you're supposed to do. So when I decided to go try and compete, like, I brought that intensity with me. And what I've learned from that part of the journey is that intensity has a place. However, if you break all of your chew toys, nobody's going to want to play with you. So be nice to them and they will come back.
That's a good point. It's almost impossible to acquire and develop skill if either nobody wants to train with you or you can't train because you and your training partners are constantly injured because you beat the crap out of each other, right? It might be good in the short term. There might be some benefit there, but over the long term, it's going to stunt your growth.
Exactly. And I hope you guys learn from my mistakes that, like, there is a place and a time for that. But for me, that place and time is in competition. I don't want to bring that intensity to my everyday practice, especially because I want the practices to not only be for me, I want them to be there for my partner. It's, especially when you're practice for competition, it's hard because you have to put yourself first in so many different ways that you also need to recognize the opportunities for your partners to gain from that as well. And so for competition, I do flip the switch. And what I tell myself is, in that competition, we both agreed to sign up for this. Like, both have agreed to try to kill each other without killing each other. So my favorite technique, like, lay on those wrist locks. Don't let go unless they tap. And if they don't tap, unfortunately, you have to be ready to break it. And that's something I haven't had to do, but I've mentally told myself that I have to be prepared for. And I wouldn't do that in class. Like, I would not break my partner's arm if they're not going to tap. I'm going to let it go because I want to have them come back tomorrow so that I can try to get them in that position again if I'm preparing for a tournament.
That's an interesting point. And I mean, I think in large part, I don't compete, and this is a big part of it. When you compete, you are having to accept a risk of injury, both to yourself, but also to accept that per the rules of the game, you may be placed in a position where you have to injure the other person within the rules of the game. And I mean, some people just aren't comfortable doing that, right? It is something that you have to decide beforehand that you're willing to do. Because like you said, right, otherwise, what's to stop your opponent from just not tapping? If they know that you're not going to go through with the submission, they can just sit there all day long. And so that's a decision that you have to make beforehand if you want to be serious about competing. And that's one of the things about being a competitor that is a very hard decision to make. And it's a very personal decision that you have to come to terms with before you go out there and do it.
Yeah, and being a masters and an adult competitor, it's kind of nice that the masters division, we have somewhere to be the next day and like jobs to get back to. There's a different understanding. However, because masters is relatively new, it's really interesting to see the development of masters tournaments from the beginning to where it is now, that those competitors that are 30 years old or older, like master one division is still intense. Like it's bringing that intensity that the adult level has. Like you can see it in the fights, but when you go further up into the master levels, you'll see a lot more unspoken understanding of, okay, we gotta work the next day. Let's not break it. Okay.
Now, do you think there's something about age and wisdom that maybe helps people deal with this perfectionism problem? Because there is that kind of old joke about how in the adult divisions, the competitors are basically trying to kill each other to win, right? It's victory at all costs. Whereas in the Masters division, it's kind of like you mentioned earlier, it's a happier and it's more relaxed and it's kind of like a big celebration and everyone's generally happy whether they win or they lose. Do you think there's something to that where maybe maturity gives you that insight about perfectionism? I'd just be curious to know if you've ever experienced a real difference in those divisions.
I will have to say I'm only 32, so my master division is still pretty small. However, I do have students that compete in higher master divisions. So I'm going to lay what I'm going to say based off of their experience and outside experience looking in. Because I started competing like about 3 months after I started jiu-jitsu. I'm a very competitive person. That's just how I've always been wired. So I do feel that the adult division it just brings a different type of intensity level. And the wisdom, there could be something there, is that when we get injured as we get older, it takes longer to heal. And I feel as you go higher in those master divisions, because it takes longer for your injuries to heal. And the reality is we want to get right back to the mats. After we compete, I want to go the next day after I compete and go back to my gym and start training again. And so if you're injured or you're unable to go back to that place, it takes you away from the hobby if you're a hobbyist, or if you're a competitor, it takes you away from your outlet that you wouldn't have if you were injured and got injured in that master's division.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah, I really do think there is something about wisdom as we get older.
Okay, so one other thing I'd love to pick your brain about. Do you think that being competitive, you mentioned before that you're a competitive person, and I think anyone who competes in jiu-jitsu obviously will have that trait. Do you think that being competitive and being a perfectionist go hand in hand? Because it sure seems like so many people out there who compete have this problem and they battle with this a lot. I mean, I'm not aware of that many competitors who just go in there and they've got a smile on their face and they're happy whether they win or lose. I think everyone knows that they'd be healthier mentally if they could roll with the punches a little bit more, so to speak, but it's so hard to put into practice. And I just wonder if you think it's just inherently harder to do if you're a competitive person.
Yes, I do. I do feel like you will grapple with being a perfectionist. And I mean, there's a couple of reasons why, and I know we referenced it earlier, is when you are trying to execute your moves, you're going to be drilling those exactly how you want to try to get it done. You're going to be setting goals. And when you set goals, if you're a competitor, you should be shooting for those stars, like high out there so that you can land on the moon. Like there'll only ever be one, if you are competing, there will only be one champion that gets what they want on that day. And you want to try to attain to be that champion. So people who are competing are probably going to have that be their main goal of winning the whole thing, and believing that they have that opportunity within themselves. And I think the reason why competitors and that perfectionism align with each other is also your like mindset. Like you have to like try to execute exactly what you've been trying to do. And perfectionism, it's really difficult is when you don't reach those goals and you don't get that first place podium, you're not happy. And that shift has to happen in your mindset. Your mindset has to change if you are unhappy with that result and it makes you feel really bad and down on yourself. You have to figure out the way to define the positives and to accept that not everything is going to be perfect. True perfection is unattainable. Nothing is perfect. There are always small flaws or ways that you could have done it better. And even if you got first, sometimes that perfectionism tells you that you didn't do everything you could do. And that's a really difficult mindset to have. So you have to be a perfectionist with some grace. You really need to allow yourself definitely a nice helping of grace so that if it isn't perfect, it's okay. Like recognize the positive things that are there and that have happened from the competition.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, right? Because on one hand, you don't want to be a perfectionist because that's going to destroy you mentally. But on the other hand, you also have to always have the drive to improve and be better. So it's a very delicate balancing act, right? To always want to learn to improve, but at the same time to not hold yourself to some unattainable standard. So like with a lot of things, right? It's kind of like a balancing act. You need to be driven to be better and to be ambitious and to get better and to develop skill. And it's totally fine to be driven to accomplish certain tangible things like to win a tournament, but you don't want to be so invested in that it becomes a crippling problem for you. And it's a very, very difficult thing to juggle for sure.
In wrapping this also into feeling like an imposter, if you wrap your results of a tournament inside your identity, then your identity that you've aligned for yourself might not be, you might not feel like you are, let's say you just recently got promoted from blue to purple and it's your first purple belt tournament and you lost. You did everything right, but you got submitted in that first round. And there's ways to find excuses for yourself, or you can take accountability. And if you took accountability, you now might feel that you're not that purple belt. You should be a blue belt. You aren't your belt level. But the reality is you need to believe in your coach that you were promoted for, in that reason, and also know that like it's okay. Like losing a tournament is okay. Like it's not your identity. It's not the end of the world. It's hard to hear that if you just lost, because people told me that advice, and I've absolutely felt like inside my head I'm listening to them like and I'm thinking inside, no, you're wrong. You have no idea how much work went into this. I'm devastated. Looking back at it now, it's all experience to where I am now. It's okay.
Yeah. I was talking to, I guess you know this, we've got a series on our premium service with Nick Perler, wrestling coach out of the States, who was talking quite extensively about how he coaches his athletes on mindset. And of course, being a wrestling coach, most of his athletes are much younger. And so they don't have that perspective. And, they are always battling with these perfectionism and mindset issues. And he's got a bunch of great exercises that he suggests people do to, one of the things he talks about is, he encourages people to kind of plot out what their life's going to look like, whether they win or they lose. And what a lot of athletes realize is, look, even if you lose the tournament 10 years from now, you're probably still going to have an amazing life, right? Even if you lose, that loss could be a learning experience that sets you on a different path and opens up different opportunities that you never could have imagined. So often being able to look into the future and to understand that, this one tournament, it really doesn't matter that much in the grand scheme of things. It can be a very freeing thing, I think, for competitors to look at things that way so they don't get their heads stuck in what's happening in this exact moment. Because I know when you go into a competition like that or any big high pressure event, it can feel like your entire life is at stake, but it really isn't.
No, and I've definitely experienced that competing. It's so funny is one of my first tournaments as a blue belt was for Naga, and I was trying to cut weight. And it was one of the first times I'd ever cut weight, which I was doing absolutely wrong. Like dehydrating myself, not eating, and like, all right, I'm going to make weight and I'm going to do great. And Why I mention this is because I go in and I end up losing, and I thought the whole entire world was ending for it, and it wasn't. And I look back and I'm like, oh my gosh, I did that all for a naga.
It's funny. I remember there was a local tournament that I went to up here in Vancouver. Tiny, tiny local tournament. Like, it wasn't even a Naga tournament or anything. It was tiny. It was just being run out of like a high school or college gymnasium or something. It was not a big deal at all. But the people there were taking it so seriously. There was some junior guy, I think he was a white or a blue belt, who threw such a tantrum they actually had to escort him out of the building. And I'm just sitting there thinking, like, guy, you just had to be physically restrained and removed because you got, excessively aggressive over this tiny tournament that no one even cares about. All that was on the line was like a $5 plastic medal. But to you acted like this was a life or death thing, and like, have some perspective, right? And I think that's where perfectionism can be a problem, is because people, they don't have the context to understand, like, look, this is not that big a deal. Life goes on, roll with the punches, don't take it so seriously.
Yeah, and have fun with it. It's okay.
Awesome. Well, hey, I do have a question for you. If you are having a bad day, you got to blow off some steam, what kind of games do you play to chill out and to get your mind back in the good space?
Games is in games or games with jiu-jitsu?
I meant games, but whatever floats your boat, honestly.
If I'm having a bad day with jiu-jitsu or with life, which one?
Well, jiu-jitsu, that's kind of the topic here. I'd be curious to know, you get stomped at a tournament. What do you do to blow off some steam?
I really like to, if I get smashed at a tournament and I'm really not in a good mood, I will actually take time away from jiu-jitsu. And if I'm taking time away from jiu-jitsu, I will go do other hobbies. So if my mind is in a creative place, I'll work on blowing off steam by focusing on, I like to make dice jewelry. So I'll make something creative that way. Or since I play Warhammer, I'll work on figurines, painting them or putting them together or modeling. And if it's something that's not going to be a creative thing that can get my mind off of that, I'll play Warhammer with my friends or Crisis Protocol, or I'll go play board games. And why those things help alleviate the steam is it just allows me to focus on something else that I can be competitive at and focus the energy into different strategies for those games. So specifically for games, I like to play Warhammer 40K, or board games. I really like worker replacement games, like resource management games.
I don't have the patience for those. They feel like work to me. That's the thing. Every time I play a resource management game, or I just kind of look at this and I'm thinking, like, man, this is basically just like a dressed up Excel spreadsheet. This feels way too much like my job to be fun.
But what I love about resource management games and or worker replacement games is it allows you to, if you're allowing your mind to like get in that groove and rhythm, it can get you into like that flow state for, okay, what am I doing in this next round? So it's like for jiu-jitsu, I'm also thinking about that. But if I'm like burnt out from jiu-jitsu or feeling like too much pressure or angry because I lost and how to improve from there, it allows that similar type of mindset to be transferred onto a different playing field. And so like for me, that's why I really enjoy them, is it allows me to have that strategy and like figure out what's the best way to do this given the resources that you have.
Yeah, that's actually a good point, which is that sometimes, if you are getting smashed at something and it's not fun anymore, sometimes stepping away and going into something else and switching the context can be really, really helpful. I feel sometimes like jiu-jitsu people feel like jiu-jitsu needs to be your whole life all the time and there must be nothing else, and any moment not on the mat is a moment wasted. But, it's really good to carve off some time and actually step away. It gives you perspective. It gives you a chance to decompress, like you said. So, I'm a big fan of gaming. I think it's a great way to blow off steam, and it's a great way to kind of reset sometimes, especially if you had a bad day.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really important to take that time away, because some of the biggest steps in growth for me is taking away that step. So like Another important reason besides like the growth, like getting away from the frustration, if you're having that, is knowing that your worth is not entwined with jiu-jitsu. And also, if you ever get injured, because jiu-jitsu is the only thing in your life, it can feel devastating when that happens and you can't do the thing you love and the thing you've wrapped your world around. It's good to be diverse, to allow yourself to have other things if that happens, and find ways to like incorporate what you love, like conceptually about jiu-jitsu, into something else that you're also passionate about.
Awesome. Well, hey, before we tie this up, Lyzz, any closing thoughts or things you wanted to share that we didn't have a chance to get into?
I just want to mention one. I don't know if we've discussed this, so please let me know if we did or not. But one of the hard parts for me for breaking through the imposter syndrome is being a female within jiu-jitsu. Sometimes the respect, or it's not necessarily the respect, it's because it's so male dominated, it's difficult to be recognized as the position you are. So an example of this for me is like when I was out at tournaments, when I was purple belt and brown belt, being a coach, just helping my fellow students and teammates, coaching them. And sometimes now that I'm a black belt, is that when I'm at those tournaments and the match ends, people will ask, like they won't shake my hand. And it's not because they're trying to be rude, but it's because they misidentify me as like a girlfriend or a wife or a mom for the person. And I feel like that really also wraps in, for me, being a female in the sport, how it makes us struggle a little bit further, is that we have to not only get past the barrier of identifying that, okay, you are the strength, you have this skill, you identify as that, but we also have to get past that we have to prove that we are the ranks that we are, that we are actual practitioners as well into the sport. So I just wanted to make note of that if you are, and also how to help that, like if you're at a tournament, shake everybody's hand. And another reason why I mention this is because recently on Instagram, another female was talking about her experiences, and she also experienced it. It's not uncommon.
Yeah, man, I'm sorry to hear that, but yeah, unfortunately, that's an experience that I think is too commonly shared. But I mean, hey, people like you are kind of blazing the trail to move things along. As I mentioned earlier, we're still very male dominated for sure in the sport, but there is progress, which is great news. And hey, congrats on the big win. If people want to follow you or get in touch with you, how do they do that?
They can follow me on Instagram at Ms. Daemonette, or they can contact me via Facebook. Those would be the best places to go.
Awesome. And as I always do, I'll put the links in the show notes. So if anyone wants to follow Lyzz, easy one-click stop to do so. Just pop open the show notes and off you go. And of course, if you don't already know, the podcast is brought to you by BJJ Mental Models Premium. I highly recommend everyone goes to bjjmentalmodels.com to check out everything we make. There's over 200 episodes now of free podcast content out there, all of it educational and timeless. There's also our awesome newsletter you can get on board with, as well as a form where you can contact me. And of course, you can sign up for Premium. That's where we've got all of our premium audio courseware, longer form, more structured material than what we put on the show. We're just actually in the process of launching a new course with Rafael Lovato Jr., which I'm super excited about. And the first week is free, so you can try it at no cost. BJJmentalmodels.com is where you go to do that. But Lyzz, thanks so much for coming by. Really happy to have you on. And man, congrats on a really great year.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. It's a real honor to be on this podcast, and I'm really excited for the Rafael Lovato.
No worries. Glad to hear. Well, hey, thanks so much. And of course, to everyone listening, thanks to you as well. Really do appreciate it. And we'll see you soon. Take care.